Coming up. In fact, it's such a bad look that it prompted what I can argue, using the old phraseology from Sports Illustrated magazine, is this week's sign the apocalypse is upon us. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? I'm going to be honest with you. Like many of you, I've been really down in the dumps since the inauguration. We went from having a president who recognized that our political class wasn't putting the American people first and who took steps to resolve the problem, to a new President Biden who seems hell-bent to re-enter every bad deal exited by President Trump so that we can return to a time where the administration seems to think the American worker works for it instead of it working for the American worker. I've watched as the media, which attacked President Trump like a pack of wolverines irritated by gingivitis, jock itch, and the heartbreak of psoriasis, now treats President Biden like a 78-year-old nursing home patient with a heart so weak you can't risk upsetting him by telling him the cafeteria is out of tapioca pudding today, let alone ask him a tough question about his administration effectively telling up to 10,000 Keystone Pipeline and construction workers to learn to code. I've watched as a group of rebellious day traders and others on Reddit chose to push back on incredibly well-financed Wall Street hedge funds shorting stocks, most prominently video game retailer Gamestop, so aggressively that the hedge funds threatened the survival of the stock. The Redditors pushed back by organizing a buying campaign that was so successful that it pushed up the price of the stock at one point by 1,700%. The result was that hedge funds lost billions, and some had to be bailed out with loans from other Wall Street firms. Incredibly, one of the investors who was anticipating a positive result for GameStop before the buying push from the rebellious purchasers on Reddit was Dr. Michael Burry, the man who predicted the bursting of the real estate bubble that led to the Great Recession of 2008. Who successfully shorted the real estate market to untold financial success, and who was portrayed so effectively by Christian Bale in the 2015 Academy Award-winning film, The Big Short. So the guy who made his reputation identifying the collapse that virtually nobody else saw coming was placing his bets on GameStop for the long term. It seems he didn't see GameStop as a company going down the tubes, at least not in the short term. So keep that in mind. There's at least an argument that GameStop's future is not as bleak as some, perhaps many, believe. But a future so bright that it would warrant going from $3.30 a share last year to as high as $492 a share this year? That's another thing entirely. But does it justify what the stock trading app Robinhood did? Well, what did they do? They shut down the ability to buy GameStop shares, but not the ability to sell GameStop shares. So what happened with the share price? It dropped dramatically. Now, it seems there's a widespread agreement, not surprisingly, by the way, that the price of GameStop shares was incredibly overinflated. So the fact that the price dropped after Robinhood shut down the ability to buy this stock using its app isn't surprising. And I expect some, perhaps many, will argue that the price drop was not the result of Robinhood's actions. Regardless, their prohibition on buying, but not selling, struck many as shocking and looked far too much like an attempt to protect the hedge funds who had shorted the stock rather than the customers who Robinhood professes to, and of course should, serve. I should let you know, by the way, that after a great deal of adverse publicity and resultant pressure, Robinhood reinstated the ability to use its app to purchase shares of GameStop, but subject to a limit which at one point was only 1 share per day. So why do I bring up GameStop's Wall Street wild ride in the context of my being down in the dumps in the aftermath of the inauguration? God knows Joe Biden and his administration have done more than their fair share of bad things since January 20. The word unprecedented is used far too often by the news media. They used it so often during the Trump administration that I suppose you could argue that they overused the term unprecedented to an unprecedented extent. I bring it up because on two separate occasions, President Biden's press secretary, Jen Psaki, refused to address what happened with GameStop. Finally today, Biden economic advisor Brian Deese of the National Economic Council said that the Securities and Exchange Commission is looking into what happened. Quote, and their focus is on protecting retail investors and also the integrity of the market, close quote. Deese made those statements on NBC's Meet the Press. What we haven't seen is a focus on what the Robinhood app did. Much of the focus in Washington, D.C. seems to be on the roller coaster aspect of the stock price for GameStop, and that clearly deserves attention. But by not focusing on what the Robinhood company did in preventing additional purchases of GameStop stock using the app, and then lifting the prohibition but replacing it with severe draconian limits on shares available for purchase, at one point as low as 1 share per day per investor, it certainly looks like the greater concern in Washington is with protecting the hedge funds run by some of the wealthiest people in the country, even when they are shorting a company so aggressively that their actions may precipitate the failure of its stock. That's a less than desirable look for politicians, being more upset by a bunch of little guys making a company's stock rise than by a handful of billionaires making a company's stock tank. In fact, it's such a bad look that it prompted what I can argue, using the old phraseology from Sports Illustrated magazine, is this week's sign the apocalypse is upon us. What exactly was that development? It was Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ted Cruz agreeing on something. Cortez, more commonly referred to as AOC, tweeted, quote, "This is unacceptable. We now need to know more about @Robinhood app's decision to block retail investors from purchasing stock while hedge funds are freely able to trade the stock as they see fit. As a member of the Financial Services Committee, I'd support a hearing if necessary." Close quote. And then it happened. This week's sign the apocalypse is upon us, or perhaps a galaxy-wide planetary alignment, or perhaps, in a reference to an old Twilight Zone episode, a penny landed on its side, or perhaps Bill Belichick smiled. Whatever it was, the unthinkable occurred. Senator Ted Cruz responded with his own tweet, quote, "Fully agree," close quote. In case you don't already know what happened next, I'll bring it up just to be clear that I'm not saying this exchange between AOC and Senator Cruz means the right and left in Congress have somehow come together, because it took AOC almost no time before she responded to Cruz by alleging that he, quote, "almost had me murdered 3 weeks ago, so you can sit this one out," close quote. Okay, so much for cooperating across the aisle. So notwithstanding the fact that the exchange between AOC and Cruz degenerated exactly as you would expect, there is an underlying message in their exchange before the degeneration, and that message isn't limited to them. It also isn't limited to Congress, and it's also reason that notwithstanding the fact that I've been down in the dumps since the inauguration, there's reason to be much more positive about where we're headed as a country. Not because I have confidence in the Biden administration, God knows I don't, but rather because I have confidence in the American people. Some have attributed a quote to Winston Churchill that I've always found amusing. The wording varies, and some have contended he never said it, but it's, quote, "You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else," close quote. So using Churchill's purported words, the question is, where does the Biden administration and Democrat control of the House of Representatives and control of the Senate through the tie-breaking vote of the vice president and the march of leftist lunacy through the academies, news organizations, and most recently big corporations rank when it comes to whether we've tried everything else? Well, you could argue that if Joe Biden wasn't working hard to satisfy the left by re-entering the Paris Climate Accords and revoking the Keystone Pipeline permit and endorsing full-on insanity of promoting transgender females who are biological males being allowed to compete against biological females in girls' and women's sports, it would look like some moderate version of the Democratic Party is what's being tried now. But President Biden is working hard to satisfy the left, and the more he does so, the more it looks like the left's version of politics is being tried. And therefore, we may have fulfilled the Churchill prerequisite of having tried everything else and will be ready to do the right thing. So that prompts the obvious question. What's the right thing? Now, I'll tell you flat out that I was impressed with President Trump. He brought issues to light that many Republicans didn't adequately appreciate, and more than any president in my lifetime, he fulfilled campaign promises. He also provoked responses that were so extreme that they have the effect of revealing the truth to the public of corruption in many of our institutions, including most obviously and most completely the press. Journalism has been described for eternity as the profession whose job is to speak truth to power. What President Trump proved is that if that job was ever practiced, it's not being practiced anymore. Far too many people purportedly practicing journalism see their jobs as getting the country to agree with their political views, whether that be through promoting the politicians with whom they agree or undermining the politicians with whom they disagree. And because the vast majority are on the left, far from resulting in something akin to a courtroom proceeding where you can hear from the attorney representing the plaintiff and the attorney representing the defense so that you get both sides of the story, in today's journalism you get one side of the story and then some of the other side of the story if you choose to seek out those sites willing to tell it to you. And it is far too easy not to do that. As a result, modern journalism, far from being equivalent to a court of law seeking truth, is far too close to being a kangaroo court seeking affirmation of a foregone conclusion. So you'd think if President Trump ran again, I'd support him, and you'd be right. But will he run again? And if he doesn't run, will the Republican Party be able to get his core supporters to show up at the voting booth? That depends on why President Trump doesn't run and who gets the Republican nomination. If the core Trump supporters think the Republican Party has abandoned him in the lead up to the 2024 election, the Republican Party is doomed. If, on the other hand, Donald Trump has moved on to his own media network or some other form of national media endeavor, the question will be whether the Republican nominee can bring out the Trump base. Side question, would that make President Trump a failure? Would it put him in the ranks of the Jimmy Carters of presidents who only served one term? No, not at all. The question is one of impact. Donald Trump recognized that a major portion of the electorate was being underserved. Actually, that's not nearly a strong enough word for it. He recognized that a major portion of the electorate was being ignored. The working class in America, blue-collar Americans especially, but not only, those in rural areas and distant suburbs, were being ignored. And the political class was instead focusing on the professional class, fellow members of the political class, the very wealthy, the very poor, and the well-off, generally well-educated residents of the suburbs. The focus was on those who benefited from globalism and those who benefited from big government. The blue-collar workers that used to be the base of the Democratic Party had been abandoned by the Democrats and ignored by the establishment Republicans who were in control prior to President Trump's ascendance. In a single term, President Trump remade the Republican Party. Notwithstanding the desires of some in the party to return to the days of Mitt Romney or, God forbid, a John Kasich version of the GOP, that Republican Party is gone. Populism is here to stay, in large part because if it leaves the Republican Party is doomed. The outreach to minorities must and will continue. The focus on solving the problems of blue-collar Americans through reduced regulation, fair trade, and stopping illegal immigration must continue. And if, as I expect, it does, we can thank Donald Trump for that. He will have been one of the most successful one-term presidents in American history. The reason why I didn't say most successful is because of President James K. Polk. As I said, the question is one of impact. In the case of James K. Polk, he actually kept one campaign promise that's probably difficult for most of us to comprehend when looking at our political class these days. James K. Polk promised on the campaign trail that he would serve only one term as president, and he kept that promise. That alone sets him apart, but it's his impact on America's future based on that one term that ranks him as our most successful one-term president to date. Under James K. Polk, America experienced its greatest expansion in history, over 1 million square miles of land. The land was acquired when Texas joined the Union, and then through negotiation with England to acquire the Oregon Territory, and finally through war with Mexico. Through the presidency of James K. Polk, America added what would become all or most of the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, California, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Texas. Try to imagine America without all of those states. The entire west and southwest of America was acquired under President James K. Polk. So no matter how strong a supporter of former President Trump you are, you understand why I rank James K. Polk higher than him as most successful one-term president. That assessment, of course, comes with two caveats. The first is that Donald Trump may end up being a two-term president. It's fun to predict whether he'll run, and if he does, whether he'll win, but frankly, it's more than a bit too early to be doing that now. The second caveat is that we really don't yet know the extent of President Trump's impact. If, as I hope, the next president campaigns on and governs with a populist agenda, either President Trump himself reelected or another candidate espousing much of President Trump's agenda, that will increase President Trump's impact on America. Likewise, some of President Trump's decisions and accomplishments could end up being even more impactful than they seem now. The multiple treaties between Israel and Arab states brokered by the Trump administration, as well as the establishment of Space Force, are two that come to mind. And if the Republican Party, with a populist focus, with an outreach to minorities, ends up experiencing long-term success in both congressional and presidential elections, that will likewise be attributable to President Trump and will increase his importance compared to other one-term presidents. Do I think it's going to happen? Well, actually, I think the likelihood of that happening is increasing. For all of his strengths, President Trump also came with weaknesses. Perhaps his greatest strength of all was the ability to control the news cycle, but that was a weakness as well. Donald Trump sucks all of the air out of every other news story when he takes action or says something. I've never seen anything quite like it, and it helped him get elected, and it helped him win political battles. But it was also a negative because so much of what he called for was so obviously what America needs. But because of the persona in which the message was wrapped, many Americans who would otherwise understand that didn't. The bottom line is that identity politics is bad for America. I've talked endlessly on this podcast about the fact that identity politics helps ensure that our system doesn't work. Under our system, if you ignore the needs of the middle class rises up and defeats you at the ballot box. But if you can convince enough members of the middle class that it isn't your flawed policies that are hurting them, but rather that the other party is out to get them because of the color of their skin, then you may be able to pull away enough members of the middle class from the other party to win your election and yet continue your policies which hurt the middle class. I've talked endlessly about how illegal immigration hurts no-skill and low-skilled labor the most. It's undeniable. But if through identity politics and promises of government benefits you can secure the votes of that no-skill and low-skilled labor, you can still win. The success of the Trump economy prior to the arrival of COVID was undeniable. But the vast majority of the media was out to deny it in any way they could. Hatred for Donald Trump just made it easier for them to do so. Now, on this point, I'm not going to kid myself that if somebody less prone to bluster somebody less prone to aggressively attack and even insult the press were to receive the Republican nomination and be elected president, that person would get a fair shake from the media. I don't think it would happen. But would that person get treatment by the media which was at least somewhat more fair than Donald Trump received? Maybe. Just maybe. And the odds of that happening, of a charismatic, well-qualified, and capable Republican candidate running on a platform endorsing the populism we've seen from Donald Trump being nominated by the Republican Party for the 2024 election, are increasing. The likelihood of that happening is increasing. The likelihood is increasing because President Joe Biden is catering to the left. The absurd coddling of President Biden by the press is apparent. The absurdity of impeaching a former president is apparent. And the talent and numbers from the Republican ranks occupying legislative and governor's offices around the country is impressive and enormous. I've spoken before on this podcast about how the Democrat farm team of talent below the presidency was gutted during the Obama years because of repetitive losses during the midterms. The opposite has happened for Republicans. The farm team developed by Republicans during the Obama years and during the Trump years is deep and wide, and the likelihood that the GOP will be able to successfully draw from that deep well of talent is climbing. And once again, there is one thing for which the likelihood is at its highest. As before, it's guaranteed. And that is that I'll be back next week with another episode of Political Spirits. Please be sure to listen and tell your friends to do so as well, and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.